I welcome everybody to this afternoon session at the Bergen Summer Research School in 2021, which will be a keynote address of Professor Anne Bostrom. My name is Gisela Böhm. I am professor at the University of Bergen, and I will be chairing this session. Before we proceed, I want to notify everybody that this session will be recorded and also streamed to YouTube. And then I have the very great pleasure of introducing Anne Bostrom. To say a few words about her, Anne Bostrom is a professor at the Evans School of Public Policy at the University of Washington in Seattle. She joined the Evans School in 2007. She graduated from Carnegie Mellon University with a PhD in public policy analysis. And her research focuses on risk perception, communication, and management in the area of environmental risks and hazards, as well as on environmental policy and decision making. Anne is one of the most renowned and distinguished scholars in the field of risk research. One piece of work that she's probably most famous for is the mental models approach to risk communication, which she introduced and where she authored the seminal papers. She's an extremely creative, prolific, and distinguished researcher. Among the many, I see her frowning, but among the many awards and distinctions that she received, she is a Weyerhaeuser endowed professor in environmental policy and past president of the Society for Risk Analysis. But she's also a regular visitor to the University of Bergen, about which I'm very happy. And I'm also very happy that she joins us at this occasion. So I welcome you enthusiastically, Anne, and I give the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Gisela. Visiting Bergen has been one of the most fun things I've done in my career, and I highly value the opportunity to be part of the Bergen Summer Research School again, which has really shaped the last decade of my research career. I'm going to share my screen now, and I encourage you, if you haven't seen the, let me see if I can get this right. No, sorry, just a second. I got to check, make sure I've got the right share here. Screen 2. Okay, this should be right. Now tell me if this works, Gisela.
Yes, all is good. You may want to go into,
Oops.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Perfect, thank you. Okay, so I've got the great pleasure today to talk about informing action on climate change. And there are lots of ways to think about this, but one way to think about this is that in the last few years, we've had a lot of advice about what to do about climate change. A couple of years ago, within the span of a month, the New York Times published 2 different sets of advice, one telling individuals to fly less, drive less, and waste less. The other, contemporary analysis, estimated that having one less child, living car-free, and flying less were the most effective ways an individual could help slow or stop climate change. So what do people think about this often inconsistent advice? And more generally, how should we think about informing action on climate change? Research on learning and science communication shows us that people are never blank slates, and Gisela's research has contributed to this considerably. Prior beliefs shape our interpretations of new information. The research results I'll present today aim to uncover prevalent beliefs about how to slow or stop climate change and to guide communicators whose goal it is to inform and support policy and personal and policy decisions on this topic. And I will be drawing from work that has been presented in large part, but not completely, in 2 papers that I'll give you the references to at the end, that were conducted with doctoral students at the time at the Evans School, Kate Crossman and Adam Hayes. Concepts of ease and effectiveness of action to slow or stop climate change have been studied and reported for several decades, but often in piecemeal fashion and with diverse formulations. Here are two examples of efficacy questions asked in prior studies, illustrating some of the differences in the types of questions that have been used to elicit efficacy attitudes. Here's the first example from Spence et al. On perceived self-efficacy and perceived individual response efficacy. They asked these two questions. I can personally help to reduce climate change by changing my behavior. This is a Likert scale with a strongly agree to strongly disagree response, or I personally feel that I can make a difference with regard to climate change. The second example here comes from Ortega Ejea et al. Perceived collective self-efficacy and perceived collective response efficacy seem to be represented in this question, which is climate change is an unstoppable process. We cannot do anything about it. And again, asking participants to either agree or disagree with this attitude question. In a survey of public perceptions of climate change across 4 European countries published a couple of years ago, two questions were asked about efficacy, which were also, and here you see the mean responses with 95% confidence intervals. So here are the means, and which to the first of two questions. So this first question here is, I'm confident that together people in my country can make a difference when it comes to climate change. And you can see here that I've shown the middle of the scale. The response scale went from 1 strongly disagree to 5 strongly agree. And I'm showing here from 2 to 4. And you can see that responses are slightly above the mean, not as close to strongly agree as one might wish, and lower in Germany than in the UK, France, or Norway. As the mixed responses to this second question in green show, techno-optimism is not widespread in Europe, with much less agreement that science and technology will solve our problems with climate change than with the first question on confidence that people in one's own country can make a difference when it comes to climate change. Note the bigger spread and slightly more extreme responses in France as compared to the other three countries, and that there is a slight tendency to agree in the UK and Norway, but a slight tendency to disagree with his statement in France and Germany. Here are two questions that were asked about efficacy in the European Social Survey Round 8, one on self-efficacy and one on personal outcome efficacy, which might also be called individual response efficacy, or the idea that one's own response to climate change will effectively help mitigate, that is, slow or stop climate change. And you can see that the first question is overall, how confident are you that you could use less energy than you do now? The second is, how likely do you think it is that limiting your own energy use would help reduce climate change? And here is a clip from the report on these results, showing the responses from 23 countries here. The post-stratification weights were applied for country-level analyses in all of these studies, actually. And the yellow bars here are personal self-efficacy. The green are personal outcome efficacy. And the scales are the same scales that we saw on the previous slide. So in all 23 countries, the mean score for personal outcome efficacy was below the scale midpoint of 5, suggesting that many people think that limiting their own energy use would help reduce climate change only to some degree. And at the top, we see here France, Germany, and further down Norway. And in all of these countries, self-efficacy is a little above the midpoint of the scale, but personal outcome efficacy or outcome expectancy, individual response efficacy, is low and well below the midpoint of the scale. So with Professor Daniel Reed and his postdocs at the University of Warwick in England and help from Gallup, we collected nationally representative data from countries around the world in 2019 and found a similar story. The question here was very similar to that used in the European Social Survey, but this was an extra question in the sense that survey respondents only answered this question if they felt like helping climate change researchers by answering a few more questions. So these are the respondents in each country who might be thought of as those most environmentally engaged and willing to donate their time. And yet we see that even in China, here, France, Germany, and the UK and the US, that people think it unlikely that limiting their own energy use will help reduce climate change. So research and theory on efficacy based initially on Bandura's work suggests that we can distinguish 6 different categories of efficacy from 3 different levels of actors. And both ease of efficacy, which is we call self-efficacy, ease of action, which we call self-efficacy, and effectiveness of action, which is response efficacy or outcome efficacy, can be distinguished by actor. So we end up with this tree, and this has not been identified very clearly in much of the prior research, as you saw. So in the rest of this talk, I'll present analyses from data collected a few years ago from a probability-based web panel designed to be representative of adults in the US. It included both interviews and surveys. And you can see here that we had a relatively large sample size so that we could represent national attitudes. In this study, we actually randomly assigned people to one of 3 framing treatments in which they were asked 3 repeated open-ended questions. So in one condition, they were asked, how do people try to slow or stop climate change? And they were asked to elaborate on that twice more. This is an open-ended question at the beginning of the survey. And the second condition, they were asked, why do people try to slow or stop climate change? And then we had a third condition, which was a what comes to mind question, which is a control condition. And policy support, the key dependent variable that we'll look at here, immediately followed the treatment in all of these surveys. We conducted a second wave of this survey a little over a week later, which showed very consistent results, but no enduring effect of the framing treatment. And the framing treatment itself had very slight effects, so I won't talk much about it today. Instead, I'll focus on the larger questions that drove the rest of the survey. So the larger risk perception and communication frame here is it effectiveness and costs, such as shown here, or is it emotions and psychological distance that drive concern and policy preferences and action, as many have speculated? So we'll be competing these concepts and looking at what people think about efficacy and what they think they and government can do, whether or not it will be easy and whether or not it will be effective. Then we also look at political ideology because this has been found to be so important in so many surveys. So beliefs about what might be effective don't operate in a vacuum. In her 2006 paper with the subtitle, Why Global Warming Does Not Scare Us Yet, Elke Weber noted that the time-delayed, abstract, and often statistical nature of the risks of global warming does not evoke strong visceral reactions. She went on to suggest that generating concern may be necessary, but not sufficient to trigger appropriate mitigating behavior. Like Elke Weber, many researchers have suggested that inaction on climate change stems from a lack of sense of immediacy of the risk it poses, which can be called psychological proximity or distance, which leads to a lack of concern and thus a lack of policy support or action. The data in our studies come from a national survey experiment designed to test one way of influencing this sense of immediacy or proximity, which is this framing effect or construal. This approach consisted of asking people to answer those open-ended questions to focus their mindset, so we didn't give them any information. So to put this all together requires 3 pieces. First is uncovering people's perceptions of efficacy. Excuse me for a second, I gotta take a drink. Okay, so the questions that we used to assess how people think about slowing or stopping climate change included their own personal action. Have you taken any action to slow or stop global warming? What action comes to mind first? How easy or hard is it for you to take this action? And what effect does your taking this action have on global warming? Collective action. If everyone in the United States collectively took this action, what effect would it have on global warming? And government action. If the United States government decided to try to slow or stop global warming, what is the most important action it could take? How easy or hard would it be for the US government to take this action? And what effect would the US government taking this action have on global warming? We analyzed interview data, but we also collected open-ended responses in the survey, as mentioned before. So this graph here represents the top 5 personal or governmental actions nominated by respondents in the study that I just showed you the methodology for, but also in a second study as well on MTurk, so 2 studies. whereof 690 of the responses were meaningful coded responses. And we had 783 open-ended responses in the national study that I showed you the methodology for. The responses were content analyzed using a structured but open-ended mental models coding scheme that was derived from an integrated climate assessment model by an interdisciplinary research team and has been applied in several previous studies. A random subset of the responses were coded independently by 2 coders with high reliability. So what you'll see here is that most frequently mentioned with an illustrative code for each word, recycling, so people said things like recycle more, automobiles, I have a hybrid vehicle, consumer demand for goods and services, for example, purchasing more eco-friendly products, energy conservation and efficiency, I do what I can to lower energy consumption, followed by renewable energy and transportation, mentioned by fewer than 10% each. Other less frequent responses included addressing pollution, which was mentioned by 5% of our respondents, reducing fossil fuel usage or CO2 emissions, which were only mentioned explicitly by 3% each, and political or civic action and reducing the use of aerosol spray cans, which is something that we've seen in surveys over several decades. And you can see here a word cloud that shows some of the kinds of words that people used in their responses verbatim. Renewable energy sources and fossil fuels were most commonly volunteered by our respondents, followed by general policy strategies in response to this question about what people thought government could do. People also mentioned things like regulation, much stricter laws, and automobiles, where they said things like keep car emissions down. And you can see here a word cloud of the responses to these questions too. Other responses included don't know or not applicable. And as the distribution of the coded responses and word cloud responses illustrate, respondents mentioned a variety of government strategies, but the distribution was really quite flat, suggesting there's very little commonality in how people think about what government can do. The question that we used included their own personal action here, and collective action, and also government action. For each, we asked how easy or hard this action would be to take and what effect it would have on global warming. I'm sorry, somebody is not on mute. And so here you can see some of the responses shown for the closed-ended response scales. For each action, the mean rating with the 95 confidence interval is presented by political ideology here and self-reported on a 7-point scale from extremely liberal to extremely conservative. So about a third of the sample falls into each of these 3 categories: conservative, moderate, and liberal. Remember that the individual items that we used were designed based on mental models research. So all the survey items came from our prior research in the interviews and research conducted before that to encompass both actions that might have a meaningful or small effect, as well as actions that might be considered misconceived of as slowing or stopping climate change, like reducing aerosol spray cans. Note that this graph doesn't show the full response scale here. The response scale went from extremely hard to extremely easy. So I'm only showing part of it. As responses tended for individual self-efficacy to be near the mean of the scale or higher. So what you can see here is an example of these responses, that voting in response to people being asked how easy or hard it would be for them personally to vote for candidates committed to slow global warming. They said that it would be neither easy nor hard if they were conservative, but very easy if they were liberal. And this spread, the directionality of the spread is very consistent across all of the responses, but you can see that differs by the item. So for example, we also coded their ratings of how easy or hard it would be, self-efficacy, to the responses that they nominated, which you saw previously on the previous slides. And you can see here that they thought that those were on average a little bit easier if they were conservative, or and a little bit harder if they were liberal. So very similar across the ideological categories. So here you can see both how easy or hard it would be for you personally to do these things, as well as how easy or hard it would be for everyone collectively to do these things. And these items are designed to cover the range of types of items that people had mentioned in the surveys and interviews, or that were covered in the integrated climate assessment model again. So overall, there is a solid appreciation that individual actions are easier than collective or government actions, as illustrated here by reducing household energy use by 20%. So here's the individual action, and here's the collective action. You can see that this is systematically lower on the scale. And so this is across all 3 levels of action here. And so to situate you, here are the ratings of how easy or hard it would be to reduce household energy use by 20% for the individual actions, doing it personally, and for collective actions, for everyone collectively to do this. So note that people do not rate the actions that come to their minds first as easier than other actions, and collective and government actions are seen as being hard. Of the government actions to slow or stop climate change, hardest is seen as hardest is geoengineering, and here this is a reduced form of this statement, but it's solar radiation management option, and you can see that this is seen as harder than slowing population growth, for example, through family planning, or enforcing air pollution control through the Clean Air Act, and it's seen as much harder than the action that's seen as easiest, which is funding research to make renewable energy cheaper or better. And this was uniformly positively rated as being easiest and effective by everybody. So the questions that we used to ask people about slowing or stopping climate change also included these response actions. So this is what effect does your taking this action have on global warming at the personal level, and collectively, or in the US government, what effect would the United States government taking this action have on global warming? So we followed this pattern of responses that we see in the work on personal efficacy previously, and on response efficacy collectively as well. So here we see how effective people see these actions, taking these actions as being personally. So this goes back to the kinds of efficacy questions that we looked at the beginning of the talk. The response efficacy questions all had a 5-point response scale from speed global warming to slow or stop global warming, with no effect being in the middle of the response scale, and additional explicit don't know response that they could give. In addition to asking people to rate the actions they nominated, for each actor, individual, collective, and government, we also presented this short list of diverse actions derived from our previous mental models research and other research on what Stern and Dietz and others called the behavioral wedge. The wording shown here is a short form, but very similar to the wording shown in the actual questions. As a paraphrase to reduce the length of the description. So respondents see the actions that they have taken or thought of taking, which for many of them was recycling, as you may remember, as having some effect, slowing global warming slightly or a trivial amount. So here's the full range of actors here for these, and you can see that these are the same items that we saw in the self-efficacy questions. All 3 levels of actions together to highlight that strategies the individuals nominated themselves were assessed as having some effect, if trivial, on slowing or stopping global warming. Collective actions here are seen as more effective than individual actions. And you can see this, they move to the right on the scale. Government actions are viewed as more effective than individual actions by liberals, but not by conservatives, if you look at where they fall vertically on the scale. And sorry, I lost my point here. And so funding research on renewable energy again, there's the open-ended here, and we can see funding research on renewable energy up here is seen as the most effective action that government can take, with the exception of the open-ended responses that they provided. And remember that these were a wide variety of responses in that relatively flat distribution that we saw. So in the model shown in the 3rd step of this presentation, response efficacy is an additive index created from the government and collective response efficacy judgments, omitting these ratings of self-nominated actions because they are such a hodgepodge of actions. And ratings of the 2 contested strategies here we omitted as well because they didn't correlate well. We used factor analysis and other analytic solutions to identify a robust index that would represent how effective people think government actions can be to slow or stop climate change. And this is shows that those questions here again, and you can see principal component and factor analyses of these closed-ended collective level efficacy items here to illustrate the approach that we took. So in factor analyses of these national data, you can see that the self-efficacy questions for collective action load together, and the response efficacy questions load very systematically together as well. So we are explaining about 41% of the variance here with the response efficacy questions, and we see uniformly that we explain less variance with the self-efficacy questions in the overall set of efficacy questions. So we're looking to see here if the efficacy questions that we asked across these different kinds of actors and across self and response efficacy as posited in the initial diagram actually turned up in the data. And you can see here that across these two different data sets, the MTurk and the national data set, and across two different kinds of analyses, principal component analyses and factor analyses, we see the same patterns of loadings. The self-efficacy are quite distinguishable from response efficacy across these, and that all the self-efficacy questions load together and the response efficacy questions all load together. And then you also see that across each of these analyses, that response efficacy tends to explain more of the variance than self-efficacy. So in our modeling, we estimate the effects of those three different survey questions with those treatments where we asked either got a why question, a how question, or a what question, which were hypothesized to promote different kinds of mindsets. So why is hypothesized to promote an abstract mindset, how a concrete mindset, and the control condition is not posited to change a person's mindset. We found a very slight effect of this framing, as I mentioned previously, on perceived proximity here, but we did not see any effects of it on any other variables in the direct responses afterwards. So we do include these pathways in the analyses that I'll show you here. So we estimated pathway variables, the response on response efficacy and perceived proximity first on emotion, and then we estimate their associations with concern and follow that with the rest of the model. And then the effects of all of these are assessed on policy support, controlling for political ideology, costs, and other factors. So here are the results, and it's a lot of data. So let me first talk about these two different models here. So on the left, we have the concern model, and on the right, we have the policy support models. We estimated these associations and stages. So first, the concern model here. And so what you can see here are all these different variables that we used in the model, the response efficacy. We modeled separately if they answered don't know instead of answering one of the other answers. And you can see that as we would expect, the don't knows result in a decrease in concern because they show disconnects basically. And we can see all the control variables here too, including, for example, age, gender, and race. And these are ordered probit analyses, and the dependent variable here is concern. So these are normalized. So we have anything that's a negative coefficient is to the left of the center line, anything that's a positive coefficient is to the right, and you can compare the relative sizes of the coefficients. So both government response efficacy, and so this is government and collective response efficacy, and personal self-efficacy are positively associated with concern in this regression as expected, all else equal. And concern is a strong predictor of policy support. So we estimate and does not mediate the effect of response does not meet the effect of collective government response efficacy or of personal self-efficacy. They still both have a direct effect on policy support, which is our dependent variable here. And the association of conservatism with policy support is still negative, but quite small after controlling for the other variables in the model. Concern does appear to mediate the effects of psychological proximity and on policy support. You can see that we have a very large effect of psychological proximity here, which is estimated as a set of three different questions having to do with different dimensions of psychological distance. And those 4 dimensions of psychological distance are temporality, spatial proximity, social proximity, and uncertainty or hypotheticality. And so we do see that this idea that something is psychologically proximate is quite influential in terms of both people's level of concern, but also even taking into account their level of concern still has some effect on policy support overall. So in conclusion, we see that people are uncertain about response efficacy and have weak emotions overall. So recycling, driving less, and reducing consumption of goods and services are the personal approaches to slowing or stopping climate change that first come to mind for many, before energy conservation or energy efficiency. Renewable energy, reducing fossil fuel use, and policy and regulatory strategies were the top suggestions for government actions, but we saw those flat distributions. There is considerable uncertainty about and lack of discrimination between the effectiveness of different possible actions to mitigate climate change, especially with regard to collective or government actions, and those beliefs influence policy support. The influence of perceived costs of climate change mitigation on policy support is dwarfed by perceived response efficacy and perceived proximity of risk and emotions. We did also test the same models on hope and found very little effect. Implications for risk communication. What should we do? Focus on efficacy and proximate risk. In addition to the obvious that people could use more help sorting out the effects of policies and practices on greenhouse gas emissions to understand what they can do that will be effective, the findings suggest that designing the context and strategies that make personal actions easier may increase perceived ease of action and strengthen support for public policies and collective actions. Getting people to think about how to slow or stop climate change may increase support for policies to do so and shrink polarization. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Anne, for a very rich and inspiring presentation, as always. So you see all the applause hands from the audience. Yeah, thank you. Thank you a lot. So maybe I can start with a question. Thinking about underlying mental models, we have results that show that people seem to have an intuitive understanding of climate change as a collective and a systemic problem. So for example, we collected pre-response, free associations to different climate actions. And when talking about individual actions, then they are preoccupied with how many people will join in. So recognizing that it is a collective problem and that they on their own won't have much efficacy. And thinking about more policy options and societal options, they're preoccupied with requirements that need to be in place for things to work, such as international agreements or infrastructure. So climate change is seen as a very systemic and collective problem. And that diminishes, of course, perceived efficacy, be it self-efficacy or response efficacy. I mean, in a way, they are correct in perceiving such low self-efficacy, right?
Yes.
So would you say that, does it make sense to try to increase perceived efficacy?
So yes, I think it does, because even though we see that it's really important that they have a collective response efficacy, as you highlighted, and as the results show, there is also an influence of perceived self-efficacy. So we see that consistently, even taking into account response efficacy, self-efficacy matters, and it's also a way of initializing collective action. One of the things that we asked about is, can you do something that will make a difference? And that includes joining other collective actions or talking with others. And this has been an emphasis of a lot of research results in the last few years is are people willing to talk about this, to make it a more collective endeavor, to create a community dialogue around what can be done about climate change, and that's been shown to be predictive of what they vote for, what they're willing to do, their sense of urgency about the problem. So it's so yes, I think it makes sense to talk about it. And we think about collective action. Collective action is by definition a set of individual actions. So we need that behavioral wedge to be able to do something about climate change.
Okay, thank you. Let me pose another question, and while I do that, I do ask the audience to please post your questions, and you can post them in the chat, and then we will forward them to Anne. Talking about emotions, you know, that's my field, and yeah, my favorite topic. And of course, I think it makes perfect sense to look at emotions as proximate causes of climate change. In a way, then, but it's like disappointing or sobering to see that emotions are so weak. As a matter of fact, we see that in our research as well. So I was wondering, you measure different kinds of emotions, right?
Yeah.
So where would you see the role of emotions, and do different emotions differ?
Yes. Well, let me just show one more slide here, if I may, Gisela, because I borrowed this work from you. So the questions that we used here. So I'm going to share my screen again here, just briefly, and show you this specific. So what you see here are the emotions that we asked about. So we asked a number of attitude questions, including several emotions: hope, fear, anger. We asked about responsibility, sadness, worry, and interest. And we asked how strongly people felt each of these things. And so I'm going to show you the results by political ideology and by this knowledge distance scale that I didn't talk about, but is in the papers that we cited by Crossman et al. And myself and Adam Hayes and Kate Crossman. And so what I'm going to show you first is these are moderates or liberals. So and these are those who had below a median knowledge score. So less knowledge, less understanding of what effective responses might be to climate change. And you can see that they're all below the mean on this strength of hope, fear, anger, and it's very flat, right? So all low emotions across all of these. And now if we look at moderates who are above the median knowledge scores, so we did a binary split on the data, you can see that the hope it's about the same, below the mean, and they get a little bit, they start moving up towards feeling something strongly, but they're not there yet. So that's the moderate or liberal who's above the median knowledge score. And then if we look at the conservatives, who are below median knowledge scores, we see that they're at the same place on hope, so still below the median, but it's flat and lower than liberals with below median knowledge scores. And then interestingly, when we look at conservatives who have above median knowledge scores, so these are highly informed, we see that their emotions are even lower. So very low responses in terms of the level of arousal and emotions that they feel about climate change and everything that they associate with it, which I think is probably consistent with your results. And when we ran the analyses for hope, so we tested both concern, which is ends up being almost the same thing as worry. We asked the concern question and a worry question, and they end up being almost exactly the same across respondents. So so you can think of them as interchangeable. I showed you the model for concern. When we did this model for hope, we found that hope is not very predictive. So there are differences in the roles that different emotions play in people's responses to climate change. Is this consistent with what you've found then?
Yes, it is consistent. Well, we didn't measure knowledge, and I think this is a very interesting aspect of the results. That for the liberals, knowledge increases the emotional reaction, and for the conservative, decreases the intensity. This is actually, I haven't seen this result before. I think this is very, very innovative. Do you think there's a motivated reasoning going on, that the conservatives, the more they know, the more they like process the information in a way that it discounts the problem?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's this kind of polarization that Dan Kahan and others in thinking about cultural cognition have talked about, but for emotions. So usually it's talked about in the context of policy support or other kinds of issues, and so it is a way of we think of it as dismissive, right? If we think about the kinds of targeting audience segmentation that we've seen, those who have the most knowledge and are conservative, it's a political ideological stance, so it's not in their identity interest to invest emotionally in the problem. So I think it's absolutely motivated reasoning going on, and they're very well equipped to do so.
Right. Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, but with respect to the distribution of the emotions, your results are absolutely in line with what we find. So usually you are in the moderate ranges with respect to intensity. Worry is usually the most intense, which is also the weakest emotion. We have little variation across countries. We have quite large surveys, international surveys on emotions, but there's not much variation. And you found that interest is highest. I mean, I would debate whether that is actually an emotion. But we find the same thing. Interest and compassion is, for example, in Norway, the most intense emotion.
Interesting. Very interesting.
So
yeah.
One thing I meant to ask you, thinking about different kinds of emotions, do you think they differ in what kinds of action they motivate? Or do they play different roles in mediating efficacy, the effective efficacy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we did find we found similar patterns. We've done a little bit of exploration of this, but haven't really done any publications on it yet. But I'd be interested in exploring this with you further. We did find that hope that was similar pattern, but really almost no effect for hope in terms of mediating the various variables that we saw mediations effects of for concern. So we do see that concern mediates and predicts. We don't see that hope does it. When we looked at fear as well, because we're thinking about fear, the fear appeal literature, and we found that fear operates similarly to concern. So not a very different pattern of mediation, and quite similar pattern of mediation actually across the fear. We have not looked at the rest of the emotions yet. So we have sadness and anger there too. So we should look at those and see. But it's we were the big question here is emotion. You know, there's this idea of the affecturistic, that emotions are what are driving people's risk assessments, and so that's what we were trying to look at. Is it is emotion that's predicting what's going on, and if you take emotion into account, does that just wipe out any direct effect of these cognitions and attitudes about efficacy? But no, it does not. You still have this. It's still important what people think is effective.
So now we do have several entries in the chat. So let's turn to the chat questions. I'll just read them to you. It's I can't. It's difficult to process them while I'm talking to you. So Maya asks, what possible impact does social desirability have on self-efficacy, and or the findings presented?
Oh, that is an excellent question. So one way to think about this is that there's a demand effect in a survey response, right? That you want to answer the thing that you want to give the answer that you think is socially desirable in a survey. And so it could be, at least in our survey assessments, that we're getting that if people see it as socially desirable to have strong self-efficacy, that we are over estimating self-efficacy judgments, which means that people have even lower self-efficacy than we might have seen. In general, I would guess that we know that these kinds of self-assessments are there are often biases in them, and so I don't know the answer to Maya's question, but I would guess that people's understanding of efficacy it's really representing some kind of state of mind rather than how easy or hard something is, and that it's probably subject to context effects like other kinds of attitudes. So it may seem and what we do know about personal actions is that they're very much driven by what other people are doing. So people's understanding of what's desirable and what is easy is a function of social norming and what other people are doing. So I would guess that there's a complex interaction there between self-efficacy and social desirability. Thank you for the question, Maya.
I mean, possibly it's socially desirable to state low self-efficacy to justify your own inaction.
Oh, that's a really good point. That's a very good point. There's another study.
Okay, another question from Sunny. I'm going to read it. The cost of living varies in different countries, not just between developed versus developing countries, but also between developed countries as well as different areas within the same country. Where the cost of living is relatively high, these people could carry a sense of entitlement that it comes to their waste production behavior while knowing they're negatively contributing towards climate change. How does this influence people's general attitude towards climate change when it comes to the reported self-efficacy value in different countries? So relationship of affluence with...
Yeah. This is another excellent question, also quite complex. I'm guessing when I'm speculating here wildly. So I'm guessing that when we think about this, people may be underestimating in affluent countries, or when they're in affluent circumstances, maybe underestimating the relative. What we know is that we see people regressing towards the mean when they estimate things. And so if you think about what that means in this context, that could mean that when people are estimating their own potential impact or their own actual impacts on something, they may be underestimating them if they're on the high side. So if you're affluent, you're spending a lot of money, you're flying everywhere, you may be underestimating your carbon emissions and your impact on climate change. Whereas if you're in a low income context or you're not affluent, you may actually be overestimating your own impact. So I would guess that this could mean that people may in fact first of all, misestimate how much they contribute personally if they're in affluent circumstances, and that they may not, that they may be justifying this again through social norming, that they feel like other people are doing it. So they may not. This would combine then to suggest that they may think that climate change is important, but may not be recognizing their own contributions. So I don't think that actually answers the question, but maybe it can get us towards thinking about that in the sense that people may not recognize the importance of their own contributions, and may not be ready to admit that they should try to do more.
Then Henry asks, what kind of barriers are produced by polarized societies, conservative versus liberal, when it comes to enacting national policy? Are there solutions to these barriers that are quick to enact?
Oh my.
That's asking for a lot.
That's $1 million question.
Yeah.
That's kind of that's a political question. I'm not a political scientist, but clearly in what we've seen, there's a ton of research on this, and I just want to call out Dunlap and Riley and many who have Aaron McBride, is that right? Many have done research looking at what's happened in the US, for example, is polarized, but we have polarization in many other countries. And what we see is vested interests spending a lot of money to stall policies, basically. So that, and so even if when you have a small minority with a strong divergent opinions, so a great polarization, that small minority, if they have political power and the resources, can completely stall policy action. And really, there's no simple quick solution to this. And in fact, this kind of a polarization question continues to challenge us even on COVID. I mean, it challenges any kind of collective action to have this kind of polarization. And this is a general problem that people are struggling a lot with that seems to have been amplified by the use of social media and our new communications approaches, where we may not understand, we may not get as heterogeneous an information flow as we had previously, and so it exacerbates polarization. So I don't think we have a quick, easy solution to that. I wish we did.
Okay. Thea asked you to post the DOI for the paper, including the emotions by political ideology, in the chat. Maybe you have a chance later to do that.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have not published those results yet. So okay. It's unpublished results. That's there are some similar results to, in the global environmental change paper that was that talks about some of the responses that we had in that Max Mosler is lead author on. I can see if I can find that.
Yeah, you can.
Thank you, Thea.
Julia asks, with respect to emotion research, inclusive of and in distinguishing Arctic and low-lying coastal communities. I'm not sure whether she refers to the international research that I mentioned, that focuses on Europe and the United States. So in that sense, I'm guilty of neglecting non-Western communities just as many research as. Well, low-lying coastal communities, that includes the Netherlands, doesn't it? They don't differ, at least not in the data that we have in the European Social Survey. But you want to say something?
Well, I was just thinking of our paper, the Global Environmental Change paper that you and I worked together with Bergen Summer Research School students on over a decade ago. And there we did have a small sample from Bangladesh, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. And they had much stronger emotions. So vulnerability may indeed drive emotions. It's a good question.
Mm-hmm. So Aaron asks, have you ever measured that assess people's understanding of what led to past social changes or their belief that a different world could be possible? Would you say people are feeling something like, that's just the way the world is, change isn't possible, there's no alternative?
So a kind of fatalism or...
Yeah, or the other way around. So thinking about mental models, are there models about a positive future, or lack thereof?
Yeah. Well, let me change the question, Aaron, and you can struggle with this yourself. So I would change the question to say that I think the collective efficacy beliefs, the collective self-efficacy beliefs in particular, are a measure of this. They're a measure of a belief. Collective response efficacy, excuse me. So collective self-efficacy, that you can do something, as you pointed out, Gisela, is really important in this context. But if you think about collective response efficacy, that something that we do together will be effective, is a measure of the ability of people collectively to change the world. So I guess I would argue that that is a measure of that.
Good point. Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a couple of more minutes, so there is time for
Thanks,
one
Erin.
or two more questions. Yes, Hans Rüdiger.
Thank you, Anne, for this load of information. Very, very great talk. I think the last question, I think was Aaron, is quite interesting, because asking for efficacy is sort of a question: what can you do within the present world or the present system? And so it's maybe not too surprising. Okay, I can recycle a little bit, I can drive less, and so on and so on. But these measures are not really sort of a breakthrough, maybe. The question is, is there any research actually asking people, can you think of a different social system, of a different world, so to say, that on a very fundamental level changes our behavior and our interactions in a way that is beneficial for the climate?
Well, may I ask you, Rüdiger, if you can posit what that might look like?
What that might look like, yeah. For example, I mean, the way we produce and consume goods is very much based on this idea of an ever-growing industry. And that is a very deep sort of foundation of how people see our world. I mean, this is sort of an ideological fundament, which I think liberals and Democrats would sort of confirm and say, oh, well, yes, we need growth, industrial growth, and but that may not. Well, there might be a world where we do not need that, and do people? Yeah, are there studies that people actually think beyond these constraints given by these very fundamental ideas how our world, our society works?
That's a really interesting question. I know that there is work in political science, probably on related questions. And I was just thinking about what you said about, we do see in recent years, one of the changes that we do see in responses and changes in mental models is that people do identify overconsumption and consumption of goods and services generally as one of the things that causes climate change. So they see this as a kind of a fundamental context for climate change, and then a promoter of climate change is the consumption economy, basically the growth economy. And so you could ask people questions about that. Ask them if we need a growth economy. One thing that's I've found a bit daunting is during COVID in the last year, we've seen people talking about what we have known for a long time is going to happen, that as women become more educated, we see people reducing their birth rates, so lower birth rates in families, and overpopulation or increases in population are one of the primary drivers of total consumption, human consumption, and impact on the world. So any decrease in population growth will contribute to an easier way of stabilizing climate and environmental impacts. And yet we see in the press already, now in the last several months, we've seen several headlines, at least in the US, saying, we're, and in the other countries too, we're worried about this decline in population growth. So not just a decline in population, but a decline in population growth that people are worried about. And so it is this growth mindset that we have to keep growing. And if we're not growing, something's wrong. So I think that's a good question. I think there's room for more research on it, because it's clear that it is a driving assumption in the way a lot of people are thinking about our human impacts on the environment and also climate change.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. Thank you.
Thank you, Rüdiger, for the question.
Thank you so much. We have actually used up our time now.
Okay.
The hour has just flown by. Thank you so much, Anne, for a fantastic presentation, and thank you to the audience for wonderful questions. And yeah, have a nice evening, and thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much for the
Yeah.
honor of being allowed to present to all of you. It was a great pleasure. Good luck with your research.